welcome to Quilters Cupboard. My name is Maddie Coughlin. My passion is wool applique. This is another tutorial in our favorites. My favorites happens to be wool applique, but also ornaments, ugly sweater ornaments. Today the tutorial is on this design that I created last year. So I'm going to show you how to put these pieces together and my favorite tools, of course. So I have Karen K. Buckley scissors for the larger pieces that I'm cutting out. These are the Tim Holtz. This is when you want to get those fine little bits going around tiny little corners. You need paper scissors. Tweezers will be your best friend. And this is just for snipping my threads as I'm stitching. So of course, needle threader for the eyes that need to see how to thread that little needle. So today, I'm going to start with the gingerbread man. When you get your pattern, you should always read through your pattern first. It'll tell you whether the pattern is reversed, and if you're using a fusible web, then you want to make sure that your pattern is reversed. Otherwise, you're going to have to flip it over and draw it out on the back side. Your pattern will tell you right off the top to read before you start, and within that it should tell you if your pattern is reversed. The back of your pattern will tell you the requirements needed for the wool and any other things that you are helpful in making this particular pattern. Some of my favorites are Soft Fuse. This is a fusible web, much like Heat and Bond, but it keeps your pieces very soft and not really stiff. Sometimes you want a stiffer product, which is where the Heat and Bond Featherlight comes in. When you have a lighter weight wool or a loose weave, and this one is a loose weave, so the ends would tend to fray a bit. That's where you might want to have a heavier fusible web. And with fusible webs, there's always a paper side, and then there's your adhesive side. So you're going to trace your pattern on the adhesive side. And when you're tracing, you want to trace the whole of the sweater. This will be your foundation piece. And then you need to trace each individual piece. So the collar, the cuffs, the band at the bottom, and the gingerbread man. These little bits here are stitched on, so you don't have to worry about those. For the other pieces, again, it's the whole of the sweater, then the snowflake, the whole of the sweater, and then each individual piece of the gnome. I have started the gingerbread man. So I have two pieces. One is my front, one is my back. The front will be the one that I'm going to iron to the Soft Fuse or the Heat and Bond. The other piece I'm going to trace onto a freezer paper. Usually you can get freezer paper, the Reynolds I think it's called, in a big roll, but it's getting harder and harder to find it. My husband bought me 4 boxes for Christmas last year. Most people will think that's a weird thing, but I loved it. Or if you can't find that, we carry Kim Deal's freezer paper. What's nice about this is that if you were doing all 3 of these, you could put this into your printer, right side down, and then you would put this freezer paper, 1 sheet, into your feed. And you can get all 3 printed at once. That way, and all you're doing is you're cutting out the body of the sweater. So this is going to be the back. It's not going to have any pattern on it or anything additional. So what I would do is I would take my scissors, my larger scissors, cut this piece when you're cutting this, you want to cut on the line. When you're tracing it out and you're cutting out the piece from the larger piece of soft fuse, be sure to leave 1/8 of an inch all the way around each piece, and then you iron it onto your wool. So now when I'm cutting it out, I'm going to cut on that line and I'll have a nice clean edge. Now I'm ready to add all the other little bits from the gingerbread man. So when you have many pieces that are going to be cut from the same color of wool, put them together. I could have put this together a little tighter so I'm not wasting so much wool, but this was a little scrap piece that I had, so I just fit them in the way that was easiest. As I carry on here, I'm going to be doing the this one here, the gnome. I did this originally on a piece of wool that is suiting wool, and suiting wool is very thin compared to these nice bigger pieces that we have in the shop. This was something I had at home and I wanted to try it. So on this piece I would use the Heat and Bond Featherlight because I want a bit more body on this. So now that I have my front piece cut out, this is my foundation piece, I'm going to start positioning my the gnome pieces. So I like to lay everything out first and then I will see if it's right. Do I need to move it to the right or the left a little bit? You know, you don't want it to be so close to the edge where you're going to be doing your blanket stitch at the end. So I take all the paper bits off the back. It now becomes a one-sided piece. You can, because you have the adhesive on one side, only one side is good. So actually the better way to start would be to position your collar and your band at the bottom, because then you know how much space you have left to actually put the little gnome in. I want to make sure my iron is hot as well. I use a hot dry iron. Actually, I use steam. I shouldn't lie. So that's his body. So when I iron, I am going to put, I want to make sure it's hot enough. Yes, it's hot. So I put it straight down and hold it there for about 10 seconds. Because you're doing layer upon layer of some things, you may need to have the heat on there a bit longer. And then when you're ready to take it off, usually at home, I wait until the steam comes all up. I just lift it straight up. See how it's held up. And then if it doesn't feel like it's adhered, then I would just put the iron back on it. And be sure not to pull the backing off of your foundation piece. Otherwise you're going to stick it to your wool mat and you're going to have to start all over again. Ask me how I know. Okay, so everything is on. I might let it cool just a bit. So while I'm doing that, I'll get rid of my garbage and get my needles ready to start stitching. I use a whip stitch because the pieces are so tiny. A blanket stitch would be too much thread. I don't like that look. So I will just, and the other thing is I like to start with the smallest pieces. So the nose, the ball here, these cuffs, and then these two, and then I would go around. So now that it's cool, this is when you want to peel the back off. As you can see, it does hang out a little bit on some of the sides. That is not a problem. You can always snip that off at the end. So now we'll take this off. There is adhesive on the back of this, so I'm going to stitch now. What's nice with soft fuse is it doesn't gum up your needle. So I have this one ready. And I'm just going to do a tiny little whip stitch. Now, this color probably wasn't the greatest for it, but it does allow you to see what I'm doing. And then just tie it off. Next, I will go for the white piece. You don't want to have this thread too long, about 18 inches or so. For the pom-pom of the hat, what I like to do is start in the middle and do like it's not quite a wagon wheel, but go from one side to the other so that I'm not stitching all the way around the outer edge. I'm doing more like a star. And don't pull your threads too tight. They'll pucker the edges. There. And since I still have white thread, I'll go on to the next bit. Here I'll carry on with a whip stitch. The thing with whip stitch too is that if you're working on bigger pieces, if you make that stitch a little longer, it looks like a blanket stitch without all the added thread around the outer edges. One thing I didn't mention was if I prefer to use wool threads. If I don't have a wool thread that matches the color of the wool that I'm working with, I will then use an embroidery floss, one that matches whatever I'm working with. And I like to use just one strand because again, I want to see the picture itself of the wool rather than all that thread. And that's a personal preference. You may like to see more of the thread. I know a lot of the books, especially Stacey West and even Lisa Bongian, they both like to do blanket stitch on everything. Although I've noticed more and more that they're saying, okay, maybe you just want to do a whip stitch on these smaller, finer pieces. That's a personal preference, and I prefer the one strand of thread. Now I'll do the red. There are several reds, but you want one that, unless you want to see the stitching. I know there's a piece I'm working on where I want to see the stitching, so I'll use a color that's not exact, but in the same family. Could be a little bit brighter, could be a little bit darker. When you're sewing the collar and the band and the cuffs on, you don't need to go around the outside edge right now. You're just going to do whatever onto the foundation piece. So I'm going to sew under here, I'm going to sew up here and up there and there. I will catch all these other bits, the outside bits, when I'm doing my blanket stitch at the end to finish off the sweater itself. there, all my pieces are sewn in place. So the next step would be to take the backing, which is this. It did have the freezer paper on it, but at home I took it off. Sometimes, if they've been sitting around for a long time, it'll come loose. And so what you would do is just take your iron and heat it up again and just press it flat on there. You probably don't want to hold it as long as you do with the soft fuse or even with the heat and bond, because it adheres quickly. And you can use these same shapes, not the ones from the soft fuse or heat and bond, but from the freezer paper. You can use those over about 3 times. So if you were doing all 3 of these and you just cut one shape, you could use that same shape and press it on whatever the backing is going to be for this one and the backing for that one. So now, this is my adhesive side, and what's nice too is that all my knots will be hidden. Some of these longer threads though I'd like to trim so they're not sticking out, although I could trim them later as well. Okay, so with freezer paper, both sides are good. With an adhesive, a fusible web, only one side will be good. So keep that in mind if there's a nice kind of modeling to the wool that you are using. Some of these have some really cool modeling in it, so there'll be brighter parts and darker parts. With suiting, you're not going to get that. So what you want to do is line up the backing to the front, put it on your ironing board or wool pad, and make sure it's all in place, and then just press it. These things. I haven't shown you my other favorite tools. This is the Clover White Marking Pen. It will mark your wool. So if you had to, in some of the patterns, I have all my displays out here, but where the buttons are on something, or on the gingerbread man where I want to do my stitching, I'll mark with this white Clover marking pen. When you first mark, you don't see anything and you think, is this thing working? But if you wait a few minutes, it comes up, and it comes off with the heat of an iron. The other thing, if you're doing something that is white and you want to put buttons, or if it's a snowman, you're putting the eyes and the mouth on, I use a friction pen. Just do dots for the eyes and even the mouth, or you can draw a line depending on what the pattern is. I'll use the friction pen, stitch in those spots, and then it's also removed from the heat of an iron. When I'm working on a darker color, and such as this piece, don't know if you can see it, but it is a sweater with a tree, and I want to put snowflakes, and they would just be French knots. So this is a white chalk marker. It's the Bowen chalk marker. It's great on the dark colors. So those are a few of my favorite tools. An awl is for when I want to, depends on how I want to hang my piece. Do I want to have thread that comes this way? Do I want to have something that's just one piece? And in some of the other pieces I have upstairs that aren't ugly sweaters, I wanted to use a ribbon this time to hang it. So I would use the awl and turn it so it goes in, as far as I need it to go. Then I'll use a needle with a very large eye. This, I guess, would be for knitting when you're sewing the seams together. I usually pass that job off to somebody else. If you don't have that, then I'll use a chenille probably a 20. I often use 24s when I'm stitching several layers of wool, but I'll use a size 20. Actually, that's when I'll use a size 20, is when I'm stitching several layers together. Most of the time, when you're stitching a couple layers, you don't need to go through all of it. You just need to go through the top layer of wool. And then I will just use a chenille 24. And I like them because they have a nice big eye. They're not too long, and they're not thick. You don't really want to have a thick needle. So I'm just ironing the back to the front. And I want to make sure it's good and adhered. If you find that some things aren't adhering, then you can use a little drop of Roxanne's Glue Based for the very tiny things, but I find that the Soft Fuse works really well. And you can just go and press it again. So as you can see, I have some pieces sticking out here. I would just trim that off before I started my blanket stitch. And even on the front side, you can see there's a little bit of gray. That's very tiny, and you don't really need to fuss with that. Sometimes you'll have a little loose piece of wool sticking up. Don't know if you can see that. So you can see it right there. I would just take my scissors and just snip that. So then for, excuse me, so for the arms, I'm just going to trim a little bit of this gray off. And then on the back, when I trim, you have to make sure that it isn't going to, wrong scissors, so don't use those scissors. What's nice about these Tim Holtz scissors and also the Karen K. Buckley, they have a serrated edge, so they're great for gripping, and especially when you're doing some fine trimming like this. It allows you to go around that edge without slipping. Okay, just one more piece. All right, now we're ready to do the blanket stitch around the outer edge. When I stitch, I will use the same color thread as my background. And when you're doing the cuffs and the band and the collar, you want to switch so you don't see that same color. In this case, it would be gray here, and I would do a red here. So for today, I'm going to sew it with a white thread so that you can see what I'm doing. And in this book by Lisa Bongian, this is an excellent reference book. She will show you how to do a blanket stitch around your outer edge, and also, you know, tips on not having to use your soft fuse or heat and bond for the whole piece. You want to keep it soft. So in her book here, she shows you how to go about, wrong page, doing your blanket stitch, and it's an excellent tutorial on that. This is where I would use a chenille 24. That one wasn't. This one is. And I would use it because I'm going through several layers. So the cool way that Lisa does it is, She doesn't tie a knot in the bottom of her thread, but she will start by, what she likes to do is go through, try to get your needle to go through the middle of the 2 layers and come out between. Don't know if you can see that, hopefully you can. So pull it out, we're going to leave a tail, and then just start your blanket stitch. So I'm going to come down right where I inserted that needle the first time, or where the thread came up. I want this thread to be behind my needle. So that's what's going to carry the thread over from stitch to stitch. And then just keep stitching. Always have your thread go behind your needle so that it does carry on across the top to kind of cover that seam. So that's how that will go. You don't want your stitches to be too long because they're going to have to come out on this side as well. That is why you want to use a thread that's the same color as your foundation piece. So I would carry that on, stop here, and then continue and go around. And same with the other side. Then I would take my red thread and do the same thing. So when you come to the end, let's see if I could just stop here. Say I'm at the end of my thread. So I'm going to take one last stitch. I'm going to tie a knot, just a single knot, so it's right on the edge. I'm going to take my needle, insert it between the 2 layers, maybe I should be wearing glasses for this. This is where a thicker wool comes in handy too. Make sure that it isn't coming out on the other side. I can see the needle here, so that's not what I want to see. You want to go in about 1 inch. So I don't see the needle here at all, and it's fine there. So I'm going to pull it through. And then I would just clip that off. I'm going to clip it there. So once you've finished the whole piece, then you come back and you clip these off. I'm going to leave them on because I want to change this to a gray wool and then do a red wool for the bottom and the tops. So you would just come and you would snip those off, and you don't have to worry about the thread coming undone because you've knotted it here and you've knotted it at the next one. So when I would start my next one, I'm going to again leave a tail, and I'm going to come up between the 2 layers of wool, and I want to be to the right of that knot, and then just carry on again. And you'll be making a knot really with the first one as you do your first stitch. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you make lots like I did. I have 4 new designs coming out. They're in the stage where they're being written up. My favorite is this one. It's got the backing there, so but that's one. Here's another. This snowman. Oops, I've got my back here. Will have buttons, and then this candy cane. I hope you can see them all there. There's going to be a little bit of accent stitch to it. So these are in the works. The patterns are being written and almost ready to go to the printer, and we'll have those into the store soon. I hope you've enjoyed my tutorial, and I hope I see you in the store. Thank you very much.